Grüezi miteinander, ganz herzlich willkommen und einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde aus nah und fern. Ich melde mich zurück mit einer weiteren Sondersendung aus Moskau von Weltwoche Daily, die andere Sicht, unabhängig, kritisch, gut gelaunt. Und ich freue mich, dass ich heute auch wieder einen sehr prominenten intellektuellen Gast hier in meiner Sendung habe. Es ist ja enorm wichtig, in diesen Zeiten eben auch mit jenen zu sprechen, mit denen eigentlich niemand mehr spricht. Das ist ja das Verrückte an unserer Situation. Alle bunkern sich ein in ihren Höhlen, hinter ihren Feindbildern und verwechseln die dann mit der Wirklichkeit. Bei der Weltwoche machen wir es anders. Wir sprechen auch mit den anderen, zum Beispiel mit den Russen, mit Exponenten der russischen Politik, aber eben auch der russischen Universitäten und der russischen Publizistik. Audiatur et altera pars, in dubio pro reo, das sind ja die guten alten Grundsätze, die leider auch in der Schweiz immer mehr unter die Räder kommen. Und heute, I will switch to English soon, thanks for your patience. Und heute haben wir einen ganz interessanten Gast hier vor der Kamera. Es handelt sich um Fyodor Lukjanow, Professor Fyodor Lukjanow. Er ist Research Professor, also Forschungsprofessor an der renommierten HSC, das ist sozusagen die London School of Economics von Moskau, das ist der Higher School of Economics und hier ist er zuständig für internationale Beziehungen. Ich habe ihn gefragt, was eigentlich sein Hauptfach ist und er hat gesagt, ja, das sei die Außenpolitik Russlands und die Außenpolitik Russlands ist ja das ganz große Thema. Es gibt ja sehr viele Sachverständige, tatsächliche und angebliche bei uns, die meinen ganz genau Bescheid zu wissen. Dann ist Fyodor Lukjanow auch Chefredaktor des Journals, des akademischen Journals Russia in Global Affairs, den Weltwoche-Lesern auch vertraut. Wir haben auch schon Aufsätze von ihm abgedruckt. Er ist ein vielfacher Buchautor, er ist ehemaliger Journalist, you're also a former journalist, also gewissermaßen ein Berufskollege. Und jetzt werde ich auf Englisch wechseln. Wir sprechen übrigens, das Thema der heutigen Sendung ist natürlich the big snorting elephant in the middle of the room, the Russian President Wladimir Putin. Also die Figur, die sozusagen die Reizfigur schlechthin ist, das ist das Thema unserer Sendung. Welcome, Professor Lukjanow, to our program.
Ja, danke schön. Ich würde sehr glücklich sein, wenn ich immer noch könnte, auf Deutsch zu kommunizieren, weil ich ursprünglich ein ausgebildeter Germanist war vom Moskauer Lomonossow-Universität, aber das war vor 35 Jahren und seitdem habe ich mit dem Deutschen sehr wenig zu tun. So leider kann ich nicht das Interview auf Deutsch machen.
Also Ihr Deutsch ist entschieden besser als mein Russisch, muss ich sagen, Herr Lukjanow.
Aber Englisch ist selbstverständlich leichter für alle. So.
Okay, aber dass Sie Ihr Deutsch etwas auf Eis gelegt haben, hat keine politischen Gründe. Ist nicht so, weil Sie vielleicht so verärgert wären über Europa und Deutschland, nein. Dass Sie sich sozusagen eine Sprachverweigerung jetzt machen hier.
Ich bin, wie heißt das auf Deutsch, Faulpelz. Also ich habe alles vergessen. Also ich habe Deutsch sehr gut gesprochen, aber vor vielen Jahren.
Okay.
Und jetzt, naja.
Aber immer noch sehr gut. Also ich muss sagen, immer noch in strong shape. You're German. Next time probably.
Ich bin wie ein kluger Hund. Ich verstehe alles, aber kann nicht aussprechen.
Okay. Also let's talk in English. This is also for me possible. Let's start with current events. Professor Lukjanow, we had a visit here by the Hungarian President Viktor Orbán. He was meeting your president, President Putin. He was in Kiev before, talking to President Zelensky. Then he went on to China, to the United States. Now everybody in Europe is complaining about, not everybody, but a lot of politicians are complaining about Viktor Orbán. They're calling him whatever, a traitor, he's creating the wrong signals. What is your assessment of this visit, of this peace mission of this man?
No, of course it was a big surprise for all of us, for one simple reason. Because if Viktor Orbán would come say, 3 months ago, that would be more or less normal, because he can do whatever he wants as a leader of a sovereign country, Hungary. But just now, as a formal chairman of the European Union, rotating president of the European Union, I didn't expect that he would dare to come. Although he didn't say that it was a mission from the European Union, but of course it was perceived in this way, partially here and fully in the European Union. So I think that Orban is a very strong personality. I never believed in his ability right now to achieve a really to start a peace process. From my point of view, just now it's simply impossible.
But what is the importance of this visit in the Russian view?
The importance is that somebody at least is courageous enough to involve in an attempt, not just to make statements, but the very fact that he visited Kiev, Moscow, then Beijing, and then Washington, including the former President Donald Trump, that demonstrated that he is pretty serious about it. And actually, at this point, again, I don't believe that something will happen, but sooner or later, rather later than sooner, but we will see, somebody will need to take this mission. And before that, it was Turkish President Erdogan who took the lead. Now it seems that relationship between Russia and Turkey is, so to say, less cordial than a year ago. Still good, but less intimate. So Orban...
Why is that so? Why is that so?
Yeah, because objective reasons. Because Turkish and Russian interests are very much diverse. To some extent, they can be reconciled. To some extent, not. Turkey is a member of NATO. Whatever we think or whatever we do, they are part of an alliance. And in this regard, I think the peak of relationship has been achieved already. It's good to maintain this level, but I don't see any possibilities for extension. But Orban now, I think he has a chance to bring some new tone in the whole debate. Not immediately, but maybe after a while.
What would you say is the impact? If you listen also to the reaction of President Putin, what he said, what he offered, how do you assess this?
Any crisis like this one cannot be resolved overnight. We understand the depth of problem, and even worse, that there is not one problem but several problems intertwined. The very conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this is a minor part of the whole constellation. The major part, the most important part, and actually what was the casus belli from the point of view of Russian leadership, it was not Ukraine, it was European and American perception of how the European security should look like. And this picture emerged immediately after the end of the Cold War.
We will talk about the reasons for this war shortly, but I just wanted to close in on this topic of Orban's visit. I mean, President Putin gave a speech as well. He presented his point of view. Was there anything surprising, anything interesting you thought in what Putin said after the meeting? Because Orban, he actually wanted to convince the president to have a ceasefire. Are you ready for a ceasefire? Because Orban thinks we should first have a ceasefire and then peace talks. This was like the pièce de résistance. That was the core of his proposal. The reaction of President Putin, what do you say?
I don't think it's doable just now because, as you certainly know, the narrative on the Russian side, which is very stable and which is being repeated by President Putin over and over again, is that we made steps towards NATO, towards Ukraine, many times before, even before this war, during many negotiations with NATO about European affairs. And each time it ended up badly from the Russian point of view, because NATO didn't want to make any compromises, didn't want to take any Russian concerns into account. And that's why now, and he repeatedly said it recently,
yes,
in his speech in the foreign ministry, for example, before Orban's visit, that no ceasefire before we agree on at least contours of the future peace.
And what is what would you say is the most important thing for President Putin to enter discussions about a ceasefire? What is the most important issue there, the pillar of peace for Putin?
My view, which might be challenged by other people, is that the whole story, a very tragic story, it's a real disaster what is happening. From my point of view, that is a total catastrophe for all politicians and all diplomats who could not prevent this from happening. But the key element was not about Ukraine. It was about how Russia perceived extremely consistent and pretty aggressive policy on the American and European side. Not just NATO expansion, that's the result. But the reason, the root was that no one wanted even to listen to Russian arguments about that the European security should be built on different premises. Just dismissively ignored. And that brought it to this situation. And I think that now the key element is not about territories. Okay, Putin made very clear statement, the minimal gains which should be achieved, which is debatable, of course, and will not be taken by the other side soon. But the main thing is about the status of Ukraine, neutrality, non-membership in NATO, and as the next step, discussion about how the new security arrangement in not in Europe anymore, because Russia doesn't talk about European security anymore, in Eurasia at large should look like in the next period.
That's very interesting. As you're saying, it's not the territorial issue, it's actually the security issue. It's the question of neutrality, and it's the question of a security architecture after the war, which is perceived totally different in the West.
No, initial impetus was exactly this. About you certainly remember the memorandum issued by Russian Foreign Ministry in December 21, and that was about NATO. That was not about Ukraine. Since it was dismissed by NATO, they said that this point about non-enlargement and so on will not be discussed at all. Then it came to the military phase, and of course, since beginning of the war, and especially since collapse of the attempt to stop hostilities in Istanbul, Minsk and Istanbul, then territorial issues came because the more Russia gains, the less likely is it that Russia will give up. The territory is already taken. But again, the initial point was not about Ukraine and not about territories.
What is, I mean, the most obvious and simple question, what actually is the reason for this war? Why did President Putin send troops into Ukraine? Which is, of course, a total shock. In Switzerland, in Germany, when I was there, a lot of people didn't think. They thought, well, he puts his troop up there to put pressure on the negotiating table, but they never expected him to go in. They thought, now he's become crazy. It's totally Corona-style derangement syndrome or something else, or Putin has changed his character. The people were extremely shocked. And now there is the narrative, of course, he's the conqueror, he's the imperialist. Can you bring us back to this decision? Why do you think the president decided to go into Ukraine with troops?
First of all, people were shocked not only in Switzerland or in Europe, but also here. very few people believed that something like this would possible. Even those who welcomed this decision, but they didn't believe it would come that far. I myself belong to those who denied the possibility of a war until almost the last day.
Me too.
Yeah. And after that, I was a bit depressed by many things, but including by my personal failure. And I tried to understand together with my colleagues who were in approximately the same situation, why we failed so miserably. And I think the reason, many reasons, including probably our low-level, professional level, no doubt about that. But I think the main thing is that all of us underestimated the how sharp contradictions went at that time already. And you ask why Putin decided to go with troops. I think because he concluded that there is no other way to get counterparts in the West to at least start thinking about their strategy. He came to power almost 25 years ago as a person who really wanted to make Russia part of the Western-centric system. Mm-hmm. Of course, as a real Russian patriot, you may even call it nationalist, he wanted special conditions. He wanted special status of Russia, but in the Western-centric system. It was absolutely no intention to revise something, to destroy something. He accepted, as many people here, that, okay, after the Cold War, the West prevailed.
But he didn't want to enter the Western system as a protectorate or as a whatever, as an underdog vis-a-vis the United States.
No, of course, he wanted to change the very logic which was embedded in the whole process since, I would say, 1990, the unification of Germany, which was based on the presumption that NATO is a guarantee for peace and security in Europe. Unified Germany became part of NATO with endorsement of the Soviet Union, of then-time Soviet leadership and Gorbachev, because the prevailing idea was that NATO is a guarantee for very good life for everybody. Mm-hmm. Soviet Union and then Russia were never happy about this, but they more or less accepted. And again, Putin was not inclined to destroy this completely, but he hoped, especially at the beginning, in his first years as president, that he can convince Western counterparts, especially in Europe, that the system should be adapted to the more, so to say, just posturing, to the more equal situation for everybody. And Russia raised concerns about security issues actually all the time, including the period of Yeltsin. Mm-hmm. Yeltsin was, contrary to his public image, he was never a big friend of NATO. Mm-hmm. He believed that we could not do anything.
Even Mikhail Gorbachev said NATO was going too far and that they have let him down and promised they would not expand. Is it actually true? Did the NATO people, the Americans, promise Mikhail Gorbachev not to bring NATO into the former Warsaw Pact countries?
Yeah, indeed. Now we know a lot of documents and a lot of books written, including in the United States, very brilliant books, that promises have been made, but never written down. Mm-hmm. And the logic of Americans after collapse of the Soviet Union was actually a little bit cynical, but very simple. Sorry, situation changed.
We are the winners, you are the losers, and we are writing the rules.
We had agreements with the country which doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But let's go back to this decision to enter a war. Of course, one can argue and say, well, you know, the West didn't take the Russians seriously. It was humiliating how Russia was treated after the fall of the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, to command a rather large fighting force into a country which is so close to Russia, such as Ukraine, what do you think triggered this decision? I was told by people I talked to, they said, well, we had a civil war going on for 8 years. I mean, Russian-speaking people were killed. You had a government in Kiev discriminating the Russian minorities. What do you think triggered actually this very brutal decision, one can say, to enter the Ukraine with troops? There must have been some kind of tipping point.
First of all, we don't know, because whatever we think, whether we like it or not, but the Russian system of political decision-making is, to put it mildly, far from transparent. Mm-hmm. So we can speculate, we can learn something afterwards. So now 2.5 years after
what does your personal intuition and all your knowledge say?
Yeah, my personal intuition is that, first of all, history will judge whether this decision was optimal or not. Secondly, I think President Putin was absolutely convinced that if not Russian Federation would act first, then after a short while, Ukraine, with full endorsement from NATO, from the United States, would try to regain territory by force. And he said many times before this operation that Russian side knew that Ukraine was being prepared for war by Westerners. And that was true, because now we know it. Now we know it from statements done by Western leaders. They say proudly that, yes, we did everything to prepare Ukraine for this war. And even they say, I think wrongly, because they're lying, but they say, like Merkel or Hollande, that from the beginning they knew that Minsk process was a fraud.
Yeah,
I don't
it was like
think
just to gain time. I mean, this is what Merkel and Hollande said, to gain time to build up the armed forces of Ukraine.
I don't think they are sincere, because when it happened at that time, they really wanted to stop war by any price. But anyway, now they try to...
that's interesting. You think they're now cheating? Why do you think they are cheating?
Because they need to, because of the atmosphere in the West, they need to demonstrate that they were... Even at that time, they were even more pro-Ukrainian.
Okay, because they want to counter the reproach that they are Putin lovers.
Exactly.
So they say, no, we were tough against Putin.
Especially Angela Merkel, I'm absolutely sure.
Yeah.
So, and Putin was convinced that it was, so to say, a game for time. And you know, it might sound a little bit strange, especially to the European audience, but you should not forget that Russian strategic culture has been formed very significantly by the terrible experience of beginning of the Great Patriotic War in June 41, when Germans attacked first. And that was, especially during the whole Soviet time, that was an obsession by Russian generals and political leadership not to allow this happening again. To some extent...
It was said that, I read in a book, that actually Stalin was shocked. He retreated to his dacha. He had some kind of nervous breakdown.
He spent more 10 days or so.
Yeah, and there was really the feeling in the Soviet Union that Nazi Germany could crush Stalin.
No, it was this feeling was a leitmotif for the whole military strategy until 80s. in the Soviet Union, because the generals or the marshals who were in charge in 70s and 80s, they fought in the Second World War, and they were really obsessed with this. To some extent, it's still there. Because
so they created this, as they call it, cordon sanitaire, which was the security belt of Russia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Warsaw
and since this cordon sanitaire and security belt disappeared, and then NATO started to push it further and further. Of course, the long-term reaction, it was accumulation of this fear, and at the end of the day, it produced what we saw 22.
Was Putin afraid that the Ukraine could slip under his eyes into NATO and become an outer base of nuclear weapons of the United States?
Certainly NATO, for sure. Nuclear, maybe. But in general, I don't know exactly what kind of fears Russian military and Russian leadership had, but clearly they perceived everything what was happening in Ukraine from the beginning of independence, but especially after Maidan 2014, as a preparation for making Ukraine a very well-established military platform against Russia.
They say that Maidan was the uprising of a freedom-loving people. Ukraine, opposite Russia, is a democratic state. Russia is an autocracy. And the people stood up against this regime, this president, Mr. Yanukovych, and so that was their free will. And Russia, of course, they never accepted it. They wanted to crush this uprising, and the West, we have done nothing. What do you say to this version of events, which is, of course, put forward in our public sphere?
You know, I'm trying to struggle against any simplistic pictures, be it the Western one or the Russian one. The Russian one, from my point of view, is slightly simplified as well. To see what happened in 2014 as the CIA plot only, that's not true. Because
it's oversimplified Russian version.
It's oversimplified version. Of course, there were many people in Ukraine who were unhappy with the political system, not only with President Yanukovych, but the whole development of Ukraine after independence was, to put it mildly, not extremely successful and corrupted and so on. So in this regard, there were objective preconditions for that. But at the same time, it's simply naive and strange to deny that this content in Ukraine has been used excessively by Americans, by Europeans, to create an environment which was politically very much pro-Western and anti-Russian, and even in terms of, how to say it, not military, paramilitary preparations. So we saw how quickly that came up from peaceful manifestations to the real uprising, military coup. And in this regard, Western picture is one extreme, Russian picture is another extreme.
The truth is in the middle.
The truth is in the middle, but I would say both sides have reasons to believe in respective version, because you can find justifications for both. But what I would clearly
point out.
deny, that Russia immediately rushed to crash this regime, this new political constellation. That's not true, because Russian reaction was Crimea. Okay, yes, that was a very special case.
Was that an annexation, or was this more of a secession?
I think it was secession, which turned into decision to reunify with Russia. And I think even those who are strictly against Russia, they cannot deny that massive majority of population in Crimea have been pro-Russian and remain pro-Russian.
They say it's a fraudulent referendum in the West.
Anyway, you know, I'm very skeptical about law, frankly, because I see how law has been abused everywhere for political reasons.
The more international the law, the more abused it is.
Exactly. I think everybody knew and knows now that the Crimean situation was very special, and that was very much Russia-oriented. It was a different thing with Donbass, because Donbass would probably never happen, I mean Russian involvement in this, without domestic turmoil, which started immediately, not because Russia launched it, but because people in that part of Ukraine were heavily and highly unhappy with what happened in Kiev. And then, of course, the decision by the Ukrainian leadership to suppress it militarily, that actually put fire and kicked off the civil war.
But what do you make of the official narrative that there are these terrible neo-Nazis running the show in the Ukraine? You have these ultra-nationalists. That was at the beginning a strong position, which was totally ridiculed in Switzerland. In the West, they said, now Putin has really lost it. I mean, he's talking about Nazis in Ukraine. You have a Jewish president. What he's up to? Of course, I have always to say, many people talking about Russia and Ukraine in Switzerland, in Germany, they don't know anything about the history of those two countries. I would never say I know a lot about it, but you know, something if you read and you have certain experience. But what do you make of this narrative of neo-Nazis, of really extreme right-wing elements in the Ukrainian government or around the Ukrainian government?
You know, first of all, this argument that it cannot be not Nazi element in a country run by the Jewish president, if we buy this, then we should say that in the United States there is no racism because they had a black president.
Yeah.
But it's not the case. Yeah. So this argument is not very convincing. As for the neo-Nazis and the ultra-nationalist element, you know, I would say that the roots of this situation go back to the very beginning of Ukrainian independence, when Ukraine...
1994.
1991.
1991. 94 was the contract.
And the specificity, the uniqueness of Ukraine, which no one in the West wants to accept and acknowledge, is that this country has always been very complex, complicated, very fragmented in terms of identity. And a very big part, I don't know, majority or non-majority, but a big part of population has been associated themselves with Russian culture, Russian language, and more or less with the Russian state. Mm-hmm. When Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union in borders which were created by the Soviet rulers, and that's Putin said it many times, the West doesn't listen to that, but this is true. This is very true, that Ukraine, the huge state of Ukraine, has been created by Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev.
And you can even add, it was somehow created also by Hitler, because after the contract they made, then they put some parts of Poland to the Ukrainian...
West, anyway, that was a very complex country. The country which, for objective reasons, had difficulties with building up a very coherent and non-controversial identity for the state building. And those territories populated with Russian-speaking people, they had no state-bearing idea. Mm-hmm. Who had this idea were people from Western Ukraine, for whom nationalists and Nazis were heroes. like Stepan Bandera and others.
Because they defended them against the Bolsheviks, against Stalin, against all these...
Bolsheviks, and they felt more inclined to look at the West than at Russia. For many reasons, I can understand them. But what I try to say, this minority, actually very, very tiny minority of Ukrainians, turned to be those who defined the whole ideology of the state, because that was the only idea which was there. And then the whole development of Ukrainian statehood, which was very bumpy through those 30 plus years, but that was at the end increase of that psychology and identity against other identities. And when it came to the Maidan situation and what happened after, actually that version of Ukrainianism prevailed. Whether neo-Nazis prevail now or not, I don't know. I'm not that, because we are pretty isolated from what is happening in Ukraine. We don't know much. But I think that now it's not that important whether particular Nazi leaders are there, because their heroes who collaborated with Nazis during the Second World War, they are now accepted as all nation.
They're part of the
symbols.
National mythology, you can say.
And then, is it Nazi, not Nazi? Of course, you can choose the answer, but from our point of view, because we have very special memory about those people. By the way, Poles, they also do. So for us, it's very difficult to reconcile with the idea that all those people are heroes of the current Ukraine.
How do you think does this Ukraine war go for Russia? Is it successful? Is it a mess? Is it where do we stand?
I'm not a big military specialist. More than that, the specificity of this war, which is accompanied with a very intense information efforts on all sides, is that we don't know what is going on, actually. Frankly, I don't trust any military specialist, because I know that all of them are very much partisan. But I think that one is clear: the initial idea failed. The initial idea what should be achieved soon and how, that failed for many reasons. And I hope that sooner or later in the future it will be a very unbiased investigation what mistakes were made in the preparation of this campaign. After that, it was an attempt to conclude the hostilities by signing Istanbul Agreement, which collapsed because, at least to a large extent, because of intervention of Americans and Brits. And since that, we see very difficult military campaign with pretty big efforts on both sides, with successes which are less than efforts.
Is it turning into a kind of a real world war? Are we on the brink of a even nuclear confrontation?
I don't think we're on the brink now, but the question is whether the whole campaign can be escalated to the next level or another level. And the initiative of the escalation comes from the Western side, because the more sophisticated arms come to Ukraine, the more likely attacks against the Russian territory, the proper Russian territory, are, the closer we will get to the decision here to use the nuclear factor, not rhetorically, but also at least to start preparations for something.
What do you make of the NATO summit just recently, where they said, okay, this is a road a continuing road. It's unstoppable, and we have to prepare for a very long war. And the Americans are now sending Tomahawk cruise missiles back to Germany. Yeah, how is this NATO posture now perceived in Russia?
It is perceived as it is said, preparation for a long war. Not necessarily a war in Ukraine, but the Cold War of the most severe sort. Because the Cold War, as we remember, had different stages. The first period, 50s and beginning of 60s, was extremely nervous and risky. Almost no rules formulated. After Cuban Missile Crisis, we arrived to the situation with pretty nasty but very stable confrontation. So now we are rather in the first stage of the Cold War. And
it seems to me even it's more crazy than the original Cold War. It reminds me, do you know this movie, Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick? I think we're in a kind of postmodern version, or in a Dr. Strangelove 2.0, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, might be. I think you're right that the situation now is worse than during the Cold War, number one, because at that time, despite severe differences and ideological confrontation, very clear ideological confrontation, both sides had completely different views of how not just the world, how societies should work. But despite this, it was a certain degree of mutual respect at that time, and acceptance that the opposite side has right to do.
And communication. I mean, we remember after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy, he called General Secretary Khrushchev. They installed a phone line,
red line, yeah.
A red line,
yeah.
and they start
hotline,
to talk. A hotline, right? But they don't seem to talk anymore. But probably the Americans and the Russians still talk.
The hotline does exist still now, but the question. There is no problem with communication in today's world. Not at all. Not like at that time, because at that time they had to establish this hotline. Now everything is available, but the question is that in 50s, 60s, and especially in 70s, both sides understood that there is a very serious standoff, but so to say, the opposite side has right to be the opponent. Now what I see is, especially on the Western side, there is a aftertaste of the victory in the Cold War. It's still now, Americans and Europeans consider Russia as being, Russia has no right to behave like this. Russia lost the Cold War, Russia should accept it.
It reminds me a little bit of colonial times, when the European colonial powers said, we have mutual respect among each other, but against the barbarian nations, we are the ruling class, and we have to teach these minor people our rules because we are the crown of civilization. And some of this rhetoric I find today in this new formula of democracy versus autocracy. We are the champions of democracy, and the Russians, they're living in medieval times of autocracy, which is somehow the excuse, the moral excuse to deny the Russians the rights you were speaking of.
Absolutely, and I think in general that the whole attempt to frame international system in these categories, not just vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis China as well, from my point of view, it's so much already now, it's so much outdated, because look at the world, how it has changed. In 1990s or early 2000s, okay, America was unchallenged, and that was at least some reason to believe that this version of the end of history might work. Not now. Everybody sees what is happening, and in this regard, I think that big changes will come. And of course, being here in Moscow, we look at events in the European Union and especially in the United States. with a big, how to say it, surprise.
Would you say that the United States and Europe, from a Russian point of view, from your point of view, from the point of view of many people here, colleagues, are the enemy? Would you speak of an enemy today? Is this the enemy of Russia?
It's a good question, which I cannot answer actually, because I think that at the end of the day, the bottom line, you cannot say that Russian people sees the West as the enemy. That's clear that in the Ukrainian context, and Ukraine is again, rightly or wrongly, we may debate. We might have very wrong view, but this is our view. So Ukraine is not Poland, is not Estonia, is not Romania. Ukraine is very special for Russian mind.
What is special about Ukraine?
Special about Ukraine is that Russian statehood was born in Kiev. Russia was baptized in Kiev. Territories, big territories of today's Ukraine has always been seen as an integral part of Russian world. Not Russian world, Russian state.
And Novorossiya, for example?
Novorossiya, eastern part of Ukraine, and for a very long time in history, you could not identify a mental border where Russia stops, Ukraine starts also. And again, of course, Ukrainians would immediately dismiss everything what I say, but it's not about who is right, who is wrong. It's about how the perception has been shaped, and those perceptions are very stable here.
Yeah, I forgot to ask a question before. Now it pops up to my mind again. We have to add it now. They say, President Zelensky recently said, also in an interview, says it many times, he says, Putin, he wants to destroy the Ukrainian nation. That's what he said before he made his invasion. He said, we are not the real state, there is no real Ukrainian nation, it's just some kind of artificial stuff, and he wants to crush, he wants to destroy the Ukrainian nation. This is what President Zelensky also said in the Swiss parliament when he stood there. It's what a lot of people believe in Europe. What would you answer them? Is Putin about to destroy the Ukrainian nation?
No, I don't think Putin is about to destroy Ukrainian nation. What is right, a Russian view on how we should position ourselves vis-à-vis Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian people as a nation, it's not established yet. It's not shaped yet. And even President Putin made statements which are sometimes contradictory to each other. And this is not because he has no idea, but because that's really, from Russian point of view, it's an extremely difficult notion. But I don't believe that Putin wants to destroy anything. Actually, if you remember his big article published half a year before the operation started, and that was called About National Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. His point was that, yes, we believe that Ukraine actually is the same as us, but history made Ukraine another state, dependent state, fine. We can accept that with one condition, that this second state, second Russian state, as he formulated more or less, will not be anti-Russian, will not be instrument against Russia.
Do you think that the West tried to turn Ukraine into a weapon against Russia?
At the end of the day, yes, of course. I don't know whether anybody formulated in this clear way, but yes, of course, it became it.
They say in the West, they say in Europe, which is, you could say, it's like a standing formula, it's like a conventional wisdom. Even our most prestigious newspapers write it down. They say, of course, this is an imperial mission, an imperial conquest. Putin is this aggressive nationalist, and he wants to build the former Soviet Union. That's an imperial quest. What do you say?
No, it's not an imperial quest. I would say that some people in Russia would love to see it as an imperial quest. Many people miss empire and the Soviet Union for reasons, some of which are very understandable. But I don't believe that any serious politician here would consider this option available. Yeah. It's simply impossible. Even if Putin or anybody else would like, it's out of reach.
And what is the strongest argument you would put on the table if you were in a TV discussion in Switzerland or in Germany when they would attack you and say, well, Mr. Lukyanow, of course, you know, that's why he enters Ukraine. He is this imperialist, and imperialism is somehow the raison d'etre of Russia anytime. Just look at the size of your country.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would find right words in such kind of discussion on the German or Swiss television. I'm not a big speaker in this regard. But, you know, actually it's a very interesting discussion. If we would have this discussion not on television,
sure,
but
I mean, we have it here, so we can elaborate a bit.
Yeah,
it's not
because yes, indeed, looking at the map, we conclude that this is a country which is based on eternal expansionism, and that might be seen as a embedded imperial instinct.
Right.
But I would argue that this instinct, and we saw it again before this war started, this instinct is based on the feeling of insecurity, because Russia is a very flat country, which during all its history was very much afraid of invasions from all sides, be it east, be it the east, be it the west, whatever, the south. And Russian expansionism was an attempt from the beginning, was an attempt to push.
So more square kilometers meant
exactly.
More security.
Exactly, this cordon sanitaire again. And we see the same now. And in this regard, coming back to Putin, he's in a way a very typical Russian ruler, with instincts same as Russian princes had, say, 500 years ago, adapted to the current situation, of course. And about empire or non-empire. My view, again, it's very controversial, and many people challenge me. Probably I'm wrong, but I think that it's exactly the opposite. What is happening is not imperial quest. It's a quest for self-identification, to formulate finally borders of Russia, which Russia considers to be natural and how to say it, rightful, so to say. Because I don't know how this campaign will end. I don't believe in the idea of some ultra patriots here that Ukraine should be eliminated. I don't think it's doable. But the line at the end most likely will mean the border of Russia, cultural, mental border of Russia for the next time.
I mean, but to look at the situation, I mean, this is my view of it. I would say, I mean, if Russia or China would make a military alliance with Mexico or with Canada, the American government would not wait for 8 years to enter. They would enter immediately. I mean, this is somehow a law of nature, of geopolitics, that these big powers, I consider them predator powers. Everybody of them is some kind of a predator, these big powers, coming from a small state. They have their security zones. And the Americans have their Monroe Doctrine, the Chinese have their South China Sea and their North Korea, and Russia has this cordon sanitaire in the West. And if the Russians would interfere in the United States hemisphere, the Americans would kick them out immediately, as they did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So has Putin, in a way, waited too long? I mean, the Americans were expanding. They went into Ukraine, even though he said it at Munich, he said it for many years. Is Putin actually, like in the Roman history, the cunctator, the guy who waited too long, and now he overreacted in a certain sense, probably also of panic?
Not panic, certainly. Putin is not a person of panic. To the extent I know him and I can imagine his psyche, it's far away from the panicking. But yes, indeed, Putin, at the end of the day, Putin has always been very, very cautious politician and cautious leader. He
no long wars, just probably short.
No long wars, no big cataclysms. Not just in the foreign policy, in domestic policy as well. He has always been very clear what he wanted to achieve, but he tried to avoid any kind of big clashes from the beginning. And he came at the time when he needed clashes because the state was in such a miserable shape. He had to demonstrate power to get things done. And even at that time, he did it in a very accurate manner. Whether he waited too long, maybe, but at the same time, that's the question to the other side, because the other side was able to ignore absolutely everything. Georgian war was a very significant signal. So, hello.
How strong is the military-industrial complex in Russia? I mean, they say, for example, in the United States, even presidents warned about it. They said, President Eisenhower said we have to beware of the military-industrial complex, the great general. Is there a military-industrial complex in Russia as well, driving the president?
No, for sure not. President is trying to drive the military-industrial complex now, because military-industrial...
It's the other way around.
Yeah. Military-industrial complex was extremely influential in the Soviet Union, but it was significantly destroyed after the end of the Soviet Union by purpose or by stupidity, by reforms which were very badly calculated. And what is happening now, I understand I understand some risks. Of course, the more military spirit, the more appetite on the side of people who argument why we need more and more money and so on. But it might be a problem in the future, not yet at all, because Russia now is trying to catch up. Because compared to the military-industrial complex in the United States, it's nothing.
Time is running out for the first part. I would love to add a second part, because there are so many questions, but probably don't overextend this first part. My final question is how to get out of this mess now, how to get out of this Ukrainian quagmire.
If I would know this answer, I would probably sit not here but somewhere else, much higher placed.
Are you pessimistic about the whole situation, or is it?
I don't expect any conclusion soon. I think that at this point, and by the way, Viktor Orban's tournée demonstrated that once again, neither side believes that the game should be over. So we see that both Russian and Ukrainian side continue beef up the capacity, and the difference is that Russia is doing it by itself. Ukraine is totally depending on Western and United States, and that might be a a changing factor if American policy will change with, for example, arrival of President Trump. Not necessarily, by the way, because I think that expectations that Donald Trump would immediately turn around the whole American stance, I'm not sure. It might happen differently. But so far, I don't see any willingness and any readiness to launch some kind of discussion, not in slogans. I would probably guess that this year will be continuation of military hostilities. Next year might be important because of what will happen in Russia and Ukraine and on the battlefield, and also because of what will happen in the United States and in Europe.
Professor Lukyanow, many thanks for this assessment of a difficult situation, offering your views. Thank you.